Hi, and welcome to School Shorts. I'm Melissa Chan Green, journalist and a mum just trying to do the best I can to help my kids read, write, and learn. Because no parent wants to think that their child is maybe not reaching their full potential, right? So it was really eye-opening for me when I started finding out about the science of how the brain learns to read, because knowing that can actually make quite a big difference. In this episode, we speak with Dr. Carolyn Strom from New York University. And as a leading expert in this area, she explains that no brain is born to read. So how it's taught to read is really important. Thank you so much for joining me, Carolyn. I'm going to start where I know, which is not really as a neuroscientist, but as a mum. And I know that the learning that I've been doing with my daughter, who's nearly 2, in terms of her oral language, so much of that has developed because we've just been talking a lot and reading a lot of books. And so I wondered, is that the same way or the same process that the brain learns to read?
Right. There is this sort of misconception out there that, if we just read to our kids and expose them to language and make them fall in love with books, that just in the same way as they've kind of acquired spoken language, then suddenly written language, letters and sounds will just click, right, by osmosis or something. And we really know that that's not the case. Like, we don't learn to read in the same way that we learn to speak, right? We're social beings and we're wired for social connection, and therefore we're wired for spoken language because we're wired, right, to connect. But written language is an invention, right? Written language is really squiggles, lines, and dots, right? That we assign sounds to. And it's actually a whole written system that needs to be taught. It's not going to just be kind of acquired in the way that spoken language is acquired. So while reading to kids, right, and talking about books with kids and building their vocabulary and expanding conversation is incredibly important. It's not enough to assume that, oh, my child, I'm building their spoken language, therefore they're going to just acquire written language.
Does that mean then, if we have to teach our brains to read, that you're not just born with a brain that's going to be good at reading or bad at reading? Like, can you build a good reading brain?
Everyone has to build it, right? None of us are born reading. So there's no brain that comes with the area called the letterbox. There's no brain that really comes with that, which is the thing that reading brains have, right? Which allow us to read. We actually all of us have to build a reading brain.
So does that mean that if you looked on a scan of someone who has taught themselves to read or being taught to read and someone who hasn't, would you actually see a difference?
Completely. So this is what's known as like the universal signature of the reading brain, right? We have people who can read have activity, right, in what's called the letterbox, the area of our brain that responds instantly to words and produces, activates pronunciation and meaning. Readers have that. And then people who have never learned to read do not have this specialized area, right? This specialized area of our brain that responds to written words. So we know that
you're either born with or not, you actually create that area.
Yes, no one is born with that. No one is born with the mechanism allowing us to read, right? So we all have to build that. And it's actually we're retraining our brains to see these letters or squiggles, lines, and dots, and instantly connect them to spoken language, right? We're rewiring our brain for this new cultural invention.
You've got a wonderful way of explaining about the different areas in the brain that lead to building a letterbox. And my son, when I told him about the different cities that you talk about, he got it. It's easy for a child to understand. So can you explain how that works?
Yeah. So, with kids, what I like to tell them is it's not just like we have one area of the brain that helps us read, right? It's actually different neighborhoods in the brain have to work together to form a whole new city. right? A whole new brain city, I call it, right? And so it's not really just one area working by itself, but it's these cities working, it's these smaller areas working to form this bigger city or big circuit. And so I tell them that, we all have these areas of our brain called meaning mountains, right? It helps us make meaning of the world, of what's going on. It helps us remember the names of things and remember things we've done, right? So we call that meaning mountains, this area of your brain that really understands things, that makes sense of things. And then we also have an area of our brain that's responsible for processing sounds, right? And that's called Sound City. And that's what helps us hear sounds and produce sounds and talk to each other and hear the difference between and right? Like it's a whole area responsible for sound. And Sound City and Meaning Mountains kind of come together to make what we call spoken language, right? Which we all have because we can speak to each other, right? We have spoken language, we can understand each other, we can speak to each other, and Meaning Mountains and Sound City are like the areas that are really giving us that power, that spoken language system. But when we learn to read, right, we actually have to use a whole different part of our brain. We have to use vision, right? We have to use the part of our brain that processes things we see. And so I say that's called vision villages, right? And vision villages is responsible for recognizing faces and objects and letters, right? But again, we don't have any area for reading. And so actually what needs to happen is our vision villages, right, needs to see letters and then connect them to sounds, right? Because letters don't really mean anything. Those letters represent sounds. And in order to do that, we have to connect Vision Villages to Sound City, right? So Vision Villages has to look at a letter and remember link it to a sound, right? And when we're looking at a word like bat, we link it to three sounds, bat. And then you blend them together and then you send it over to Meaning Mountains. So it's hard. Maybe I made it more confusing without the image. But, the big idea is that we have to create this specialized area in Vision Villages, right? The letterbox, we have to create that in order to transform what we see with our eyes into spoken language.
Yeah,
Into
it does make sense. I think for anyone that's listening only, if you want to get over to the YouTube recording of this, it is really helpful to see those cities and how they kind of link towards each other to create that circuit that you're talking about. And then, so how does it link to the letterbox? Where does the letterbox come in?
Yeah. So what happens over time, right? The more that we read and we practice transforming letters into sounds and linking those sounds to words, right? The more we do that, we begin to create these neural pathways in our brain, right? And they become more well-worn, right? The neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more we practice, the more we sort of create these pathways. And once sort of we've seen a word many times and we've written it, right? It becomes stored in orthographic memory. Right, it becomes stored in this area called either the visual word form area. Right, we know that readers' brains develop this area that has specialized for visual word forms, right, letters, and transporting them into spoken language. And it can be called the visual word form area, or it can be called the letterbox. So Stanislas Dehaene, who is an incredible French neuroscientist, has coined the term letterbox for the visual word form area, which is the area that activates in skilled readers when we read.
So does that mean then if you have to kind of wire up all these cities before you can send a word to the letterbox, before it kind of becomes this instant decode, recall word, does that mean then that it's not just about memorizing words? Because we talked in the last episode with Carla McNeil and Liz Kane about why we were moving away from that. But why is it in terms of how the brain works that we're moving away from just memorizing words?
Yeah. So the letterbox, right? It's not sent to the letterbox. It's like the letterbox is sort of this new specialized neural area that develops that helps us instantly see a word, right? And then send it to spoken language. And you're right. It can feel like for a long time, a lot of people felt like, oh, we've memorized these words because we look at them and we instantly, channel spoken language. And it can feel like that because we all have the letterbox. But in order to really store words there, we know that we don't memorize words, we map letters and sounds. right? So the best way to learn to read the word booth, for example, right, is to not just memorize the way it looks, but to look at the B and map it to a B, and look at the two O's and map it to oo, and look at the two H's, the T and the H, and map it to th, right, and map it out. Booth. That's how we store the words in our brain.
Right.
We don't memorize. We recognize 50 to 60,000 words. Automatically, we haven't memorized those. Right, we've mapped them.
So
We
it's more,
we
yeah, it's
create
not
a sound.
seeing the word as a whole. It's just breaking them down and getting to a point in your brain where you can do that really quickly.
Yeah, where you
Is
can
that
specialize.
why
Your brain is
some
specialized for the parts. Does that, like, your brain has specialized for the parts of the words. It doesn't specialize for the whole.
Yeah,
Otherwise, we would like
yeah,
confuse words that looked alike all the time. We really wouldn't be able to read, right? We'd confuse sliver for silver, right?
yes.
We would confuse. We don't memorize them. We're always mapping the parts, and what happens is our brain just gets increasingly specialized to recognize units of sound in words.
Do we know why some children and even some adults might be able to see a word, a few times and then they're kind of doing that mapping super fast, and others it might take a little longer?
Yeah, people sort of have questions about that. No one knows exactly why. For some people, they can, read a word 4 times. Some kids, it takes 40 times, right? Some kids more. No one's really sort of cracked the code on why that is. All I can say is that for some kids, certain skills take more practice. Right? Some kids, they get on a bike and a little practice and they go, right? Their muscle memory kicks in, right? It's skills. Different kids kind of acquire these skills at different rates, and no one's has ever really been able to crack that. What we do know is that having a really strong spoken language foundation, right, and really strong phonemic awareness, really, and fine motor skills, being able to write the letters. There's so many subcomponents we know that predict reading.
And
So in
phonemic
order to start
awareness,
a
you're
kid,
talking about kind of knowing the relationship between a letter, the visual form of a letter, and the sound of a letter.
exactly, that's called the alphabetic principle, right? You have to understand that letters represent sounds,
Right.
right? Letters aren't just squiggles, lines, and dots. They actually represent sounds. And rather than memorize words, I always tell families to focus on 6 to 8 sounds, right? PATSIM. Focus on the sounds of those 6 letters, right? And then teach kids to read words that you can make with those 6 letters, right? Sat and pat and sit and pit, right? Really focus on building the words, reading them and writing them, or building them with magnets, instead of memorizing words and not calling attention to their parts.
Does every brain learn to read in the same way?
Yes. So every brain all around the world, if you can read, that means you've created the letterbox in your brain, right? And in order to read written language, you have to create like this interface between vision and spoken language, right? Every brain has to do that. And no one is born with the mechanism, right, that allows for fluent reading. And I know there's, arguments out there how much of it needs to be multisensory or explicit. That's really the how, right? How to teach and the methods. But in terms of the brain, we know that the brain always learns to read in the same way. You have to create the same circuit.
What is the optimum time for teaching reading? Like, what is there a certain age that the brain is like, yep, I'm ready for this now?
Yeah, I mean, in the earliest years, what you want to do is like really make sure that kids are developing spoken language. Right. I'm just thinking in the very beginning, like we think about beginning reading and people think visual, right? But it's not, it's spoken. So in the earliest years, it's spoken language, but it's also tuning in not only into vocabulary, but to sounds and words, right? Phonemic awareness. So when you're talking about, foods, you're calling attention to foods that start with like milk and macaroni and muffin, right? So you're tuning into sounds. And while that's not quote unquote teaching reading, that's tuning kids' brains to focus on sounds. And that's key, right? If they're going to ever map letters to individual sounds, they have to learn to isolate sounds and to become sensitive to sounds. So that's so while that's not quote teaching kids to read, those are critical skills to learn before formal reading instruction, and that's what you can be doing certainly when kids are 2 and 3 and 4 years old. And then the other thing before sort of formal reading instruction is also to make sure that kids know the sounds of the letters, right? That they can not only isolate letters, they know the sounds of the letters and the shape of the letters. And the more that kids can write, right, even before the age of 4, the better. And by writing, I mean, maybe if they can hold a writing utensil, great. But if they can't, that's okay too, right? They can write in sand, or I always like to use finger flashlights, those little finger flashlights that you put on your finger and then you turn off the lights and you can form the letters, right? Kids need to learn the shapes of the letters, right? And how to make the letters. So again, even though that's not like formal reading instruction, those are all key things you want kids to have, and you can be doing all of those kinds of things at an early age.
Why do
And then certainly, as we said before, with the 6 sounds, right? You can start once you know 6 sounds and you have some of the blending skills. You're able to begin to read.
Why do you say start kind of that writing instruction, even though you say it's not kind of about holding a pen and actually writing, but starting to form the shapes of letters before 4? Why that age and stage?
I mean, there's no rule on that, right? Like I wouldn't say like you should definitely do this before 4, but right, there are kids who are ready, right? First of all, who are interested in letters, and so we want to teach them how to produce the letters themselves, right? So if they really want to write a k, right, we want to teach them how to do it, right? And it's really just
using
learning.
your hand.
It's a movement pattern. Yeah. You stand up, right? And you make a K, you stretch your arm to the sky, you reach down to the ground, right? And then you make 2 lines kicking out. So you're just, it tunes our brain to think about the shape of the letter, right? And kind of to begin to connect it to our motor memory or muscle memory. And we really know that it helps, right? Learning letter sound correspondence is critical, right? And one great way to learn letter sound correspondence is to produce the letter, right? To make it yourself with your body. And we know that handwriting really helps build the reading circuit, writing by hand. And again, if they're not actually writing, we think of handwriting as holding a pencil and penmanship, but really in the earliest years, we just want them to begin to think about the shapes of letters, right? Because it begins to tune in a way, right? Our vision areas sort of to more of develop more perceptual sensitivity, right? To the shapes of letters and yeah, helps with the mapping process.
That's the visual villages. That
vision villages.
Vision villages, starting to get them fired. Yeah. I know I've spoken with a lot of parents who say, sadly their children just were kind of taking a long time to read, and they thought, it's just going to kick in at some point, and they kind of have some regret, I think is a fair enough word to say, as their children get older, that they didn't really understand about the mapping of those letters younger. Is there an age at which, and I'm sure you can teach reading at any age, but is there an age at which it kind of becomes a lot harder for the brain?
Yeah, I mean, the best years, to really start all the kinds of things we're talking about, and then to really begin to read words, is really ages 3 to 7, 3 to 8. So in the US, that's preschool, kindergarten, and first grade. And yes, it continues for some in second grade, but really in second grade here, which is ages 7 and 8, where that's when we want kids really moving up to not just single syllable words, but multisyllabic words and decode and fluency, really. So the prime years are ages 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But it's as you said, it's never too late, and kids, a lot of kids, it they need more practice beyond 7. All kids need explicit practice with multisyllabic decoding and its fluency after 7. It's not, there's this idea that like once kids learn to read, they have it. They have it. And no, like, they really need to keep building on it after 6 and 7, right? So these early skills are like 3 to 6, but 6 to 8 and 6 to 9 is like a kind of a whole nother phase of building fluency and multisyllabic decoding.
I think that's and I know that we've talked about decoding, but just to make it clear too, that that's kind of words with multiple syllables and breaking them down into their sounds and letters. I know that this is taught with a scope and a sequence and a structure, and those were all words that we spoke about in the episode before this.
Mm-hmm.
But some people feel like that all those words kind of sound kind of drill and kill, to borrow a phrase that has been used. But actually, when you're talking about kids moving their bodies and making shapes with their bodies, should learning actually be quite interactive? Is that a misconception that structured literacy or teaching in this way is quite drill and kill?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I often, say like structured literacy or phonics has like and handwriting too has a branding problem, right? It's gotten branded as like this drill and kill meaningless activity. And it's like that's just we can't really afford to do it as a drill and kill thing. I always call it thrill and skill, right? We have to get these skills. These skills are critical. We have to do it in ways that are thrilling, right? And maximize engagement, right? And help us remember, right, what we've learned. And so, it should be anything but drill and kill. Right. And so if we're talking about words have meanings, right? And so when we're working on decoding, we should always be grounding it in meaning and vocabulary, right? And sound play and word play. And kids love playing with language. Young children love fiddling around with language, right? Whether you start playing, I hear with my little ear something that begins with when you're driving in the car and you want them to point to a tree, right? Or, oh, I need a tissue for my nose, right? Like you start playing with sounds and calling attention to sounds. None of that ever has to be boring.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It feels like games to them, doesn't it? And it is really. And you mentioned one earlier too. I liked about the milk and muffin, and I guess just pointing those things out to children, pointing out, oh, I've just noticed that this rhymes with, well, I don't know, gate rhymes with Kate, or
Yes,
pointing out
yes.
rhyming words.
Yeah. Yeah. And even I always recommend it as like a guessing game, right? So if you can play like guess my lunch and you say, oh, for lunch I had and ch, right? What did I have? I had macaroni and cheese, right? Can you guess what I had for breakfast? Or right. So you can play the guess, right? Like you're thinking of your lunch and they have to guess it, or they can think of something and have to isolate the sound and then you have to guess it. Right. So anything you can do that is a language game and silly, right, at those young years is really setting their foundation up, right? They're setting up we're not reading, right? But we're really setting our system up to read.
These are all wonderful tips and great advice, Carolyn. So thank you so much. Just finally, just if you can explain why it is important for us to understand how the brain learns to read. Why should we be thinking about the different villages and how they connect as parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always important, right, to understand how we learn something, not just how to teach, right? So we really don't want, to just focus on how to teach without thinking about how is this skill actually learned, right? It helps us be more intentional. It helps us respond when kids make errors that we don't expect, right? Because we know kind of where things may have gone wrong. And I also think, it also helps us sort of be better consumers, right, of materials. So if we don't really know how kids learn, right, then we might be vulnerable to misconceptions like we learn to read whole words, which we don't, right? We're always focusing on their parts. And if we don't really understand how it all works, then I think we're more vulnerable to these misconceptions that can really hold kids back, right?
And I know you have, over your career, worked with kids and families. Can you just point to any of the changes or the impacts that you have seen on those kids and those families when they've understood the way that the brain learns to read and what impact it has had on their learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the kids and families that I work with, it kind of completes the picture for them, right? They've maybe heard a lot of words or terms or strategies, but it kind of just gives like a map, right? Literally a map, and to help kind of just make sense of it all, right? Because reading is something a lot of people take for granted. Parents take it for granted, right? And kids think that they're just going to wake up one day and read. They don't. It just right. It looks so natural to them, and so once you actually tell them no, like that's not how it's going to happen. It's like these neighborhoods need to connect, right? And you need to create these new neural pathways, and it's all this interconnected system, and every part is important. It kind of gives them an understanding. But I will also say that like it's knowledge. So getting more knowledge about how something works, right, is always great. But I think what makes families and kids the happiest and the most fulfilled is having a teacher or a tutor who knows how to teach them to read.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Like
yeah,
it's important to understand how it all works, right? But you also really need someone skilled, or to teach your child to read, right?
yeah,
That all kids need to be taught, right? It's not just going to be caught. And so hopefully they're getting good instruction in school, right? And if not, someone needs to teach a child to read. And so I think that just thinking of the families I worked with, I think that they would probably say, yeah, it's interesting to know about the brain, and it helps me. And it helps me be more intentional and more informed. But at the same time, I don't want to be the one to teach my kid to read necessarily. Who is going, like, is there a plan for this?
yeah,
Right? This is a critical skill. It needs a structure. Is school on top of it? If not, what am I doing to make sure that my kid has access to the code and is taught how it works?
yeah. And we can be wonderful advocates for our children, but yeah, there needs to be someone who is skilled and really understands the pedagogy or the way of teaching. And I know so many teachers around the world are getting that training. I just wanted to finish on a couple of things that really stood out for me, that reading is taught and not caught. I think that's something
Mhm.
really important that has come out of this discussion. And, you said neurons that fire together, wire together. And I guess that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to get all of those moving parts wiring together so that you're not memorizing or relying on sight words.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Wonderful.
Even for the words that seem extra tricky,
Yeah. Okay.
right?
That's probably good for parents and adults to know as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
There's
for
actually
your time.
along those lines, I'm just going to give a shout out to a resource that's free, and it's called Project Read. .ai, I think. And you can actually type in any word. It has a word mapper, and you can type in any word, and it'll show you how the letters map to sounds to help
Ah,
us, to help kids orthographically map. Right, that's the technical term. Like to help them break every word down into its parts,
what was that
so
one
that
called again?
whenever it's Project Read, .ai, and it's a great resource,
Amazing.
and free. And it has a word mapping tool.
Amazing. Cool. Well, thank you. You've come with all the tips today. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Carolyn Strom. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.